ago, as we've done in the past, I have been highlighting the Shrine's collections. And today I will be speaking about one artifact from the Shrine's collections that helps us tell the story of the Civil War. And before we continue, do want to encourage you to post any questions that you might have in the Q&A feature that should be at the bottom of your screen. Nathan will help moderate the Q&A at the end of the presentation. So as the presentation is going on, if there's something that you kind of think that you'd like to know more about, please do post it there and we'll try to answer your questions once we are done. So today I will be speaking about a photo album that was donated by a local family a few years ago. And let's see, as you can see, at first glance, this appears to be a family album without clear connections between the subjects. But as we continue to look through the album, we discovered that there were several photographs of men in Civil War uniforms. Some of them had names and military units written at the bottom. The album has 67 photographs. Many of them are carte de visites, or visiting cards, which you may know were quite popular during the war. So carte de visites were small, relatively inexpensive cards that included a photograph of a person and would often be given to friends and family. They were popular in the decade leading to the Civil War. And during the war, soldiers would give cards of themselves photographed in uniform to their loved ones. People would also purchase cards featuring significant political and military figures like President Lincoln and General Grant. So the album includes 33 men in military uniform. 17 of them are identified. These men all have different surnames, but they're all linked by their service in the 21st Connecticut Infantry. Researching the album brought to light some really interesting stories of the experiences these men had during and after the war. So I'll focus my time today on telling their stories through the narrative of the 21st Connecticut Infantry's wartime experience. Although I will not tell you about each man, I will focus on those whose experiences intertwine with the specific events in the 21st Connecticut's history. So just to note that while I will mention battles, the focus will be on the individual experiences. And at times I will use their own words to describe what happened. So I'm not really going to go into great detail about the battles. The mystery of this album was the man it belonged to, Colonel E.K. Chapin. The 21st Connecticut did not have a Colonel Chapin, nor did any officers have that last name. So who was Colonel Chapin? I'll try to unravel the mystery of his identity, and I'll discuss how the album came to be in Redlands. So first, I'll begin with the story of the 21st Connecticut Infantry. On August 13th, 1862, Connecticut Governor William Buckingham issued General Orders 99, ordering 7 new regiments from the state. With that, Connecticut began to raise infantry regiments 15 through 21. The 21st Connecticut Infantry was recruited in eastern Connecticut and was mustered into service in August. Recruits were mostly farmers, which is true of the Union Army in general, but there were also many laborers, carpenters, there were blacksmiths, painters, there were people who were dentists, lawyers, doctors, just to give you an idea of the wide range of backgrounds these men had. Many of them were married with families to support. Others were on their own and supported themselves with a variety of odd jobs. Combined, the federal, state, and city governments offered bounties of totaling about $300, plus added payments for men who were married. So this just kind of gives you an idea of the kinds of incentives these men had to join. The regiment had 11 companies organized under Colonel Arthur H Dutton in Norwich, Connecticut, to serve for 3 years. Dutton was born in Connecticut to one of the state's oldest families. Many of his ancestors were military veterans dating back to the Revolutionary War, and he counted Civil War General Joseph Mansfield, who died at Antietam, as a relative. Dutton attended Yale before being appointed as a cadet at West Point, and so you can see him in his cadet uniform here. At graduation in June 1861, He was third in his class, which included future Civil War notables Hugh Kilcalvary Kilpatrick, George Custer, Patrick O'Rourke, and Alonzo Cushing. He enlisted in the military on June 24, 1861 as a second lieutenant and was assigned first to the U.S. Army Engineer Corps. He was described as bold and chivalrous with a nice sense of humor, a judgment quick and decisive, an unwavering zeal in his chosen profession. He was in every respect a thorough soldier. He was quickly promoted to captain, followed by promotions to major, first lieutenant, lieutenant colonel, and finally to colonel. And he was ambitious. A friend later told a story about when he first tried on a uniform coat with the insignia of his rank as colonel. The friend remarked, "Those silver eagles look well," to which Dutton replied, "Yes, but a brigadier star would look better." With Dutton in command, the 21st Connecticut was scheduled to depart Norwich on September 11th. On the day prior to the departure, the regiment staged a parade that was described the following way. A general admiration was expressed at the appearance and marching of the men. They appeared with their new arms for the first time. The occasion was the presentation of state and regimental flags from the ladies of Norwich and Stonington. In reply, Colonel Dutton said, "I desire to thank the ladies of Eastern Kentucky, or Connecticut, for this magnificent present. At some future day, many months hence perhaps, we hope to bring these colors back to you. Time-worn, dusty-covered, bullet-torn they may be, but polluted by the touch of a rebel, never." On the day of their departure, throngs of spectators came to see them board a train. They made their way to Philadelphia, where they received a meal from the Soldiers Relief Association. And then they made their way to Baltimore and finally arrived in Virginia in October. The 21st Connecticut's first real experience on the battlefield came at the Battle of Fredericksburg, December 11th through 15th, 1862. The battle was fought in Virginia between the forces under newly appointed Major General Ambrose Burnside and the Army of Northern Virginia led by Robert E. Lee. Nearly 200,000 soldiers faced off. The 21st Connecticut was a part of the 3rd Division, which is led by Brigadier General George Getty. They helped by building earthworks near the town and took part in the fighting late on the second day. The regiment was told to prepare to take part in the charge the following morning at Mary's Heights before the orders were withdrawn. In reminiscing about the battle in 1900, Captain Alvin Crane wrote, "Had we made the charge, we should have found the enemy prepared to meet us. What would have been the result to us if the charge had been made is not difficult to determine. We must have been a torn and shattered regiment, and many of us who now live to read an account of the battle would have filled unmarked graves." Poorly planned and lacking the element of surprise, the Battle of Fredericksburg was a crushing defeat for the United States forces, with nearly 13,000 casualties on the Union side and over 5,000 for the rebels. 9 men in the 21st Connecticut were wounded in the battle. The regiment spent the rest of the winter months in Virginia, taking part in Burnside's Mud March, which was a failed attempt to cross the Rappahannock River, and then they were in Newport News. The following April through May, the regiment participated in the defense of Suffolk, Virginia, which had been returned to United States military control the previous September. The siege began on April 11th, 1863, when forces under Confederate General James Longstreet moved to capture the Union garrison at Suffolk. The 21st Connecticut spent the weeks leading up to the initial attack reinforcing fortifications around the city, making it a difficult target. Prince Philippe, Count of Paris, who was the grandson of the French king and served as an assistant adjutant general during the Civil War, described the siege of Suffolk in the following way. Suffolk formed a vast entrenched camp consisting of redoubts and lunettes, connected by a continuous belt of about 10 miles in length. Notwithstanding its extent, the belt was easily defended, about 6 miles of it protected by watercourses. The siege of Suffolk was a long affair, so it lasted about 3 weeks, and Captain Alvin Crane recalled how the men of the 21st Regiment began to get restless during the long siege and decided that if, quote, they could not get close enough to the rebels to shoot them, they would make their acquaintance in another manner. And so they decided to hold a council of war. As Crane explained, quote, The inevitable handkerchief on a stick was quickly prepared, and from behind a protected spot at the extremity of the woodland that extended into the swamp between us and the enemy, it waved for a few moments and was answered by the rebels in a similar manner. The veterans from both armies promptly stepped out from cover and advanced with that confidence which has always distinguished the American soldier, that the little emblem of peace was a protector, and that the truce would not be broken by either friend or foe. It was a long stretch of swamp that the 6 or 8 men of Company I had to pick their way over before arriving at the margins of the narrow Nansemond that divided the two squads. But they got there, and speeches were immediately in order. Billy Patterson was loaded for the rebels, and he was soon giving Yankee taffy to the dozen graybacks from the 29th Alabama, who had leisurely come down from behind their earthworks to meet us. The friendly and private communication thus opened with the rebels continued for a day or two with the exchange of coffee and tobacco. But as soon as the flag of truce affair reached headquarters, strict orders were issued, and there were no more Hello Yank or Johnny Reb while picketing the Nansemond. The Nansemond was the river that bordered the city of Suffolk. And this is not to say that the regiment wasn't busy. Lieutenant Colonel Burpee summarized the regiment's role during the siege in a report. He wrote, "On the 15th, in accordance with orders from Colonel Dutton commanding the brigade, I moved the regiment to occupy and strengthen that portion of the line of defense on the opposite side of town, extending from Fort Jericho on the right to Battery Onondaga on the left. We remained on this line until the 20th. On the 21st, we were ordered to relieve the 13th New Hampshire Volunteers on the line of pickets extending along the river from the mouth of Jericho Creek on the left to Battery Morris on the right, throwing one company over the island in front of us into the right of the battery. This line was defended until Saturday evening, May 2nd, and during that time there was much firing between our pickets and those of our enemy, but only one casualty to this regiment was one wounded man." As the siege neared a conclusion, the 21st Connecticut participated in an expedition against the rebel cavalry at Checkatuk Village on May 3rd that resulted in the seizure of Reed's Ferry and the capture of 15 Confederates from the 4th Texas Regiment. Brigadier General George Getty said of the regiment's actions at Checkatuk, "Such deeds prove the mettle of the men and show that, when well led, they need no enemy." The regiment lost 1 man with 3 more wounded during the siege. The siege ended on May 4th when Robert E. Lee directed Longstreet to return to Fredericksburg to aid the Army of Northern Virginia. As an aside, if you're like me and you're really curious about the dismal swamp that you see on the screen, it actually has a really interesting history on its own. The large marshy area was the site of a community of escaped slaves as early as the 17th century and was used as a stop on the Underground Railroad in the antebellum period. Refugee communities lived there until the Civil War. Their story was told in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Dread, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp, which was published in 1856. And today it's a protected area that's called the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge and includes the Underground Railroad Educational Pavilion. Now back to the story. The 21st Connecticut spent the following 6 months on provost duty in Norfolk and Portsmouth, Virginia. The regiment fell under the Department of Virginia and North Carolina at this point, and General Benjamin Butler took command in the fall of 1863. At this point, they took part in a raid up the James River, where they destroyed a large quantity of rebel property and captured a schooner laden with tobacco and large amounts of money in gold, silver, United States notes, and Southern bank funds, as it was described. They also found a lot of jewelry. They also captured 22 prisoners, 10 horses, and 153 contrabands, which specifically refers to enslaved people who had escaped or were affiliated with the Union military. And they remained in Newport News until February 1864. The regiment then went to Newburgh, North Carolina, where they again served on provost duty, losing 1 man as a prisoner of war. While they were there, the regiment helped transport newly emancipated people and their belongings. Captain Delos Brown, relayed the disrespectful way these people were treated by Union soldiers. Quote, "After the Negroes were all disembarked, our men were ordered on board to unload the baggage, and mounting the hurricane deck where it had been packed away, they charged upon the confused mass of African possessions and commenced transferring them in a very unceremonious manner to the wharf. The scene which followed baffles description, and I doubt if the history of the whole war can present a like scene, or the Emancipation Proclamation of Father Abraham ever called forth another such sight. Featherbeds fell like snowflakes, only rather more forcefully, upon the heads of the frantic searchers for their own household goods. Bedding, clothing, and all manner of domestic goods filled the air and fell like rain in one confused and inextricable mass. The regiment returned to Virginia in the spring of 1864, which was a little less than 2 years into their service at this point. Many of the men in the regiment had responsibilities at home, and that was the case with First Lieutenant Sirius Cook, who was married with 2 small children at the start of the war. He was a farmer, and his wife had to manage the family farm on her own while he was away. And as you can see in the excerpt from a newspaper that on the screen here, Cook asked to be dismissed to return home to help his family and was refused by General Butler, who was characteristically callous in his response, implying that Cook was lying about his family's hardships and displayed a lack of sympathy at the idea of an ill wife and destitute children. Butler, as you may know or can imagine, was generally disliked by most people. Sirius Cook remained in the military through the rest of the war and was promoted to captain in November 1864. Sadly, he died of tuberculosis just a few years after the war, and his wife died the following year, as did their children, likely also of tuberculosis. The 21st Connecticut was assigned to the Army of the James in May and encountered its first serious engagement at the Second Battle of Drury's Bluff, which is also known as the Battle of Proctor's Creek, in Virginia on the 16th. Located about 7 miles outside of Richmond, Drury's Bluff was the site of Fort Darling and was a key part of the city's river defenses. In the spring of 1864, General Butler and the Army of the James embarked on the Bermuda 100 campaign in support of Grant's overland campaign. The Bermuda 100 campaign was launched on May 5th, the same day as the Battle of the Wilderness, and was meant to threaten Richmond and Petersburg, which were defended by General P.G.T. Beauregard's forces. Butler and Beauregard's armies met in a series of poorly conceived battles before facing off at Drury's Bluff in the early morning hours of May 16th, when Beauregard's forces attacked and defeated Butler. The 21st Connecticut's commander, Colonel Dutton, who was well respected by his superior and his men, was placed in command of the 3rd Brigade during the battle. The regiment saw hard fighting beginning on May 15th, which Captain William Stone Hubble recalled at the regiment's 1876 reunion. He said, "The 21st had become the last regiment on the right of the army and was fighting in both the front and on the flank at close quarters with the foe. Heckman's brigade was entirely broken up. There was nothing before us on our right hand save the attacking rebels. On the left, we could see no one in the smoke and fog, but took it for granted that our friends were there. We were fighting on our hook with our right flank in the air and our left in close connection with no one in particular. Fortunately, we were too inexperienced to appreciate fully our peril and were not aware of the disaster which had swallowed up the rest of the brigade. We really had no idea that we were whipped and had no intention whatever of abandoning our position. It seems to be, after carefully studying the whole engagement, that our stubborn and continued resistance on the right was the main reason why the rebels failed to penetrate the rear of the 18th Corps." So that was on the 15th. The regiment was attacked at camp early the following morning and fought in the woods until noon, narrowly escaping being completely overwhelmed by the Confederates. The regimental flag, which had been given by the ladies of Norwich when they left home 2 years earlier, flew throughout the day, despite the color bearer being wounded and the flag itself being shot several times. The words Drury's Bluff were later added to the flag as a point of pride. After hard fighting, Butler fled back to his base at the junction of the James and Appomattox rivers, where he remained until Grant arrived in mid-June. There were approximately 6,600 casualties, making it the costliest encounter of the campaign. Grant was understandably angry with Butler's blunder and regretted putting him in charge of the Army of the James. The 21st Connecticut suffered 117 casualties at Drury's Bluff, with 15 dead, 81 wounded, and 21 taken prisoners of war. It represented the greatest loss to the regiment of the entire war, and May 16th was adopted as a regiment's day of commemoration in the post-war period. As Captain Hubble described 12 years later, we also made on that day many valuable discoveries in regard to the bravery and efficiency both of officers and men. As we remember how one and another behaved under fire, there was something like a revision of former estimates, and many a modest and heretofore unappreciated soldier found himself a sudden favorite. Henceforth, this standard of judgment prevailed, and promotions and honors were awarded on this basis. William Stone Hubble was among the wounded in the battle. 10 days after the Battle of Drury's Bluff, the regiment suffered another blow when Colonel Arthur Dutton was seriously wounded during a reconnaissance mission with members of the 21st Connecticut near Bermuda 100 on the James River. He was shot through the face, shattering his jaw. He suffered a hemorrhage while being transported to a hospital in Baltimore, and he died on June 5th. He had been recommended for promotion to Brigadier General on the day of the Battle of Drury's Bluff, and his promotion was posthumously accepted. He was respected by his men, who described him the following way. He was not destitute of a worthy ambition, both for himself and the forces at his command. His funeral took place in Washington, D.C., at the same church where he was married exactly 1 year earlier. He was survived by his wife and son, and his son later went on to have a successful military career. Dutton was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. After his death, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Burpee was put in charge, and he was recommended for promotion to colonel. On June 3rd, the 21st Connecticut participated in the terrible Battle of Cold Harbor, which had begun on May 31st and went on until June 12th. It was fought near Mechanicsville, Virginia, and the battle was one of the last of Grant's overland campaign. The Army of the Potomac, led by Grant, was 117,000 strong, while Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had up to about 62,000 men. Union forces left Cold Harbor on June 13th and made their way to Petersburg, having approximately 12,700 casualties, compared to the 5,000 casualties on the Confederate side. The 21st Connecticut suffered 53 casualties, including 1 dead and 1 prisoner of war in this battle. During the long battle, Lieutenant Colonel Burpee was wounded by a sharpshooter on June 9th while making his rounds as brigadier officer for the day. He died at the hospital at Fort Monroe on the evening of June 11th. As reported by Major Hiram Crosby, quote, Lieutenant Colonel Burpee had borne his part with distinguished valor during the Bermuda 100 campaign. His coolness and good judgment at the Battle of Drury's Bluff will not soon be forgotten by his comrades in that hotly contested action. At Cold Harbor, he was equally conspicuous for his gallantry. While in command of the regiment, he was able and efficient, always discharging with promptitude every duty, particularly if concerning the comfort and welfare of his men, by whom he was much loved and respected. He brought to his office and consecrated to his noble work the strong qualities of sincere, noble manhood, characterized by unflinching courage and true military bearing. Self-possessed, dignified, faithful in his duties of his office, he brought honor to the regiment. Thomas Burpee was posthumously promoted to colonel, was as an advancement that was already in the works before his death. He never learned of the promotion. He left behind his wife and 2 children who sadly fell into poverty after he died. His collection of letters and military documents were donated to the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. Following the disaster at Cold Harbor, the regiment headed to Petersburg, which was an important transportation hub for the Confederacy, and they took part in battles around Petersburg and Richmond throughout the summer. And the sketch you see here was drawn by Howard Camp, who was a corporal in the 21st Connecticut, and he was wounded at Petersburg in September. The regiment did picket duty and skirmished with the enemy for the months-long siege of Petersburg, suffering 50 casualties, including 6 deaths. One of those who was lost during the siege was Captain Isaac D. Kenyon of Company B, who was mortally wounded while at his post in the trenches of on August 18, 1864. He was originally from Rhode Island, and he was a clerk when the war began. Kenyon was married 2 days prior to the regiment's departure in September 1862. He was promoted to captain in June 1863. Following his injuries at Petersburg, Kenyon lingered for 2 weeks. He died at the Union Hospital at Fort Monroe on September 1st, 1864. He was attended by his wife and brother who had been called to his side. His body was embalmed and taken to Rhode Island where he was buried. And remembering him in the post-war period, his friends described him the following way. He most deservedly possessed the respect and esteem of his brother officers, possessing a large fund of anecdote and pleasantry. He was ever the life around the bivouac fire and always welcome at every tent. He was noble and generous-hearted, brave and unflinching in battle, prompt and energetic in the performance of duty. We miss his cheerful countenance and hearty jest. But he died a noble death, and his name is enshrined upon our memories as one of our country's heroes. One of his last wishes was that he might be buried in his military suit, and that his coffin should be wrapped in the American flag, the flag for which he left his home and friends and died defending. At the end of September, the regiment engaged in a series of battles that represented their large, hard fighting of the war. Between September 27th and October 2nd, the 21st Connecticut fought in and around Richmond and Petersburg at places like Chapin's Bluff, Chapin's Farm, and Fort Harrison. On September 29th, the regiment took part in an assault resulting in the capture of Fort Harrison, which was on the James River, and they captured 22 cannon. Captain Hubble recalled this at a reunion just 8 years later. As we emerged from the forest, we caught sight of the long stretch of ramparts running from the river for miles to the right and directly before us. Crowning a hilltop loomed up the principal object of our attack, the formidable Fort Harrison, over which streamed the rebel banner and in whose embrasures were mounted 23 pieces of heavy artillery. To the capture of this tremendous battery, we now prepared, and with little expectation of seeing old Connecticut again. Just before the assault commenced, a staff officer rode up with a message from Army headquarters that we were before the only barrier between us and Richmond and were to go forward to the utmost, remembering that the 1st Regiment to enter the rebel capital should receive promotion of 1 grade for every officer and 3 months' pay for every enlisted man. And the regiment attacked, scaling the walls of the fort, taking control and suffering only 1 casualty. William Stone Hubble was later awarded Medal of Honor for his actions at Fort Harrison, where he led out a small party of captured soldiers as well as a large number of prisoners. Capturing Fort Harrison, or Fort Burnham as it was renamed, was incredibly significant because of the threat it could pose to Richmond. Fighting over the next few days resulted in many casualties for the regiment, but solidified their control over the fort. One of the injured during these battles was Captain Perry Packer. Perry Packer was a native of Connecticut. He was working as a clerk and postmaster in North Stonington when he joined the military in 1862. He was wounded at Chapin's Bluff on September 29th and was promoted to captain 2 weeks later. Corporal Jerome Baldwin wrote about the series of battles in this letter to his friend Ellery at the end of October 1864. You can see part of the letter there, a quote from it. Baldwin was a farmer in the years leading up to the war, and he had been wounded earlier in the siege of Petersburg on June 16th. He was promoted to sergeant in November 1864, and you can see a photo of him here later in his life. We're fortunate to have this letter in our collections. The 21st Connecticut spent the following months with the Army of the James, but engaged in very little fighting. They spent the last winter of the war at camp, when they described playing music and attending religious meetings conducted under the direction of agents of the Christian Commission. The regiment had served under General Benjamin Butler for a year and a half, and were glad to learn he was recalled in January 1865. As one man remembered, quote, "General Butler is no longer in command, and nearly every soldier in the Army of the James rejoices in the fact. He has been very unpopular. I never had any confidence in him as a military commander." Butler was so disliked that the veterans of the 21st Connecticut devoted an entire section of the regimental history to the, quote, "peculiarities of General Butler." That was written by Quartermaster Sergeant Edwin Wheeler, who you see pictured here. Wheeler was just 18 years old when he enlisted as a private in August 1862. He was recommended for an appointment to West Point by Colonel Dutton, but a formal commission was never received. He worked with Butler as a clerk throughout the war and was promoted to Quartermaster Sergeant in October 1864. Edwin Wheeler said the following of Butler: "His contempt for military law and his desire to deal out what he called substantial justice often took high-handed forms. He had a habit of excessive profanity, and his vocabulary in that direction was remarkably full. The 21st had some members with a large line of swear words, but none with the versatility of General Butler." On January 4th, the regiment lost Lieutenant Frederick WH Buell, who died of congestive chills, which was a type of malaria. Buell was just 23 years old when he decided to enlist in August 1862. He married Caroline Brown, who was the sister of Delos Brown, also of the 21st Connecticut. They married just before he left for the war. He and Caroline had one son. Sadly, he died just a couple of months shy of the end of the war in Virginia, which came when the city of Richmond fell to United States forces on April 3rd. The 21st Connecticut claimed the honor of being among the first regiments to enter the fallen city, and they remained in Richmond for several weeks after. First Lieutenant Philo Fuller Talcott was with the regiment when it entered Richmond and recalled seeing Lincoln in the story that you see on the screen. Talcott married Caroline Hamilton in 1858, and he was a salesman in New York at the outset of the war. Later in his life, Talcott often told stories of Abraham Lincoln, including of seeing Lincoln in the early spring of 1865. So here's Talcott's story. Quote, "I once had a ride with Lincoln. He was down at Petersburg and he wanted to see General Hancock. Another officer and I agreed to take him to the general, and we ordered a driver to hitch up the best looking pair of mules that could be found and bring out the cleanest looking army wagon. When we were all ready, Mr. Lincoln climbed up on the wagon and I got up with him. We rode along a bit, and then the mules, feeling a little frisky, began to act up. The driver pulled on the reins and hollered at them to slow down. Finally, the driver began to swear. He called the mules a lot of names that wouldn't look well in print. Presently, Mr. Lincoln leaned over and touched the mule driver on the shoulder. 'What is your religion, my man?' he asked. The driver turned around. 'I'm Methodist,' he said. 'Said Mr. Lincoln. 'That's funny. You swear like an Episcopalian.'" Talcott loved to tell this story later in his life, and it was relayed several times when he was featured in newspapers. The regiment was mustered out on June 16, 1865, with a letter written to Governor Buckingham from Major General Charles Devons, which said in part, "The trials and dangers which this regiment have passed through will only make them more fit for duties and responsibilities as citizens, to which they now return. And their conduct hereafter will show, I sincerely believe, that the fame they have won by valor and intrepidity abroad in the field will be maintained by industry, energy, and perseverance at home." In the end, 4 members of the 21st Connecticut were awarded medals of honor for their action at the battles of Fredericksburg and Chapin's Farm. Sadly, 175 men were lost, including 6 commissioned officers, some which were included in today's presentation. And only about a third of the men from each of the 11 companies actually returned home. Here you see Delos Brown and William Hubble later in their lives. I mentioned both of them earlier. Hubble and Brown worked for the remainder of their lives to preserve the regiment's legacy, serving with veterans groups. And at annual reunions, which were held on May 16th, the anniversary of the Battle of Drury's Bluff, Hubble would recount many battles the regiment participated in, often including personal stories. Brown and Hubble also served on the committee that compiled the story of the 21st Regiment Connecticut Volunteer Infantry during the Civil War, which was published in 1900. And it was, as you can imagine, a huge help in learning about the regiment and was the source of many of the quotes that were included today. The veterans of the 21st went on to work in a variety of fields, including as ministers, insurance agents, and were active in veterans groups and politics. One veteran who was particularly active in veterans groups and political organizations in the post-war period was Captain Perry Packer. Packer married Mary Morgan in 1865 after mustering out of the military, and they had one daughter, also named Mary. He was active in local and state politics, and he served as the president of the local grant club that formed to boost Grant's presidential campaign in 1868. He was later selected to be a probate judge. Packer was also active in veterans groups, serving as postmaster of the Arthur H. Dutton post of the GAR, and was a delegate to the Connecticut State Soldiers and Sailors Convention with many of the veterans of the 21st Connecticut, which are mentioned in this presentation. He owned a store in Coventry, Connecticut. He served as a treasurer for the local Masonic Lodge, and he was trusted and respected within the community, who began to refer to him as Major or Colonel Packer, which appears to have been a term of endearment since his rank was captain. When being nominated for state comptroller in 1873, he was described in the following way. Quote, Mr. Packer is eminently fitted for the position, has a large circle of friends, is very popular throughout the eastern section of the state, and with the advantages of a brilliant war record, would add the strength of the Republican ticket. A long and successful experience in mercantile pursuits has endowed him with rare financial ability, which experience has demonstrated as essentially necessary in conducting affairs of state. Should he receive the nomination, the state would, in the event of his election, secure the services of a valuable servant. Packer's luck and his reputation changed 2 years later. In April 1875, a notice appeared in the Hartford Courant newspaper that Colonel E.P. Packer of South Coventry's business had failed. 3 months later, another article announced that Packer was in bankruptcy. As the case developed, it was covered in the local newspapers, and they showed that Packer had debts of about $35,000, which would be something like $800,000 today. He apparently offered his creditors 25 cents on the dollar. He was refused. Then in February 1876, a newspaper article provided news that Packer had been indicted. E.P. Packer of Coventry, who recently left town under a financial cloud, is supposed to have made $15,000 by his failure. His wife and Mr. Sweet, a brother-in-law, have been sued for the recovery of property supposed to have been placed in their hands by Packer. An article from the Hartford Courant newspaper in November 1875 told the story of Packer's alleged misdeeds. Quote, the failure of Colonel Packer was a surprise to all persons who had done business with him, as his credit was good. He had done a large and apparently profitable business. Suddenly he collapsed with liabilities of about $35,000 and assets of only about $6,000, so far as they could be made available. His operations in the city, where he owed some $10,000, proved to be of the most personal friendship, and even used his Masonic associations to deliberately cheat those who confided in him as a safe businessman. The facts disclosed by investigation within the past few months reveal a systematic course of deception and an intent to defraud. It will be a difficult task for the accused to finally escape trial, though he may succeed temporarily in hiding himself. So the article describes Packer as being in hiding, which was true. He probably left town in the fall of 1875. And while there were rumors of his whereabouts, where he went was a mystery to the people in Connecticut. So where did he go? Around the time Packer disappeared from Connecticut, Colonel E.K. Chapin appears in the 1876 California voter register, listed as a merchant in Santa Monica. And you can see an early photograph of Santa Monica here. It was established as a city or as a town in 1875. Like Perry Packer, Colonel Chapin was active in politics and veterans organizations. He became president of the Hayes and Wheeler Club of Los Angeles, which was a group created to advocate for the 1876 presidential ticket of Rutherford B. Hayes and his vice presidential candidate, William Wheeler. He also worked with the Republican mass meeting in Los Angeles in 1877, serving as a vice president of the group, along with California luminaries like Pio Pico, Isaiah Hellman, and William Wolfskill. While Colonel Chapin was making a name of himself in the burgeoning town of Santa Monica, the case against Perry Packer continued in Connecticut at least until 1879, which was the last reference to his case in Connecticut newspapers. So why did Perry Packer change his name to Colonel Chapin and decide to move to Santa Monica of all places? The probable answer came in an 1878 article in the Los Angeles Evening Express newspaper, where a story is relayed of Colonel Chapin and the W.C. Bassett & Co. store in Santa Monica. As reported by the Los Angeles Express in July 1878, Quote, "A burglar entered the store of W.C. Bassett and Company through the front upstairs window last Friday morning about 2 o'clock. Colonel Chapin, who was sleeping upstairs, was awakened by his movements. The colonel at once sprang out of bed and seized his shotgun. The burglar went hastily head foremost through a sash door in the rear of the store, leaving his plunder. The store's owner, W.C. Bassett, served in the 21st Connecticut as a sergeant. You can see his photo from the photo album here. In the years immediately following the war, Bassett and Chapin worked together in the local Masonic Lodge back in Coventry, Connecticut. Bassett moved to California in 1868, living in San Francisco and Bakersfield before making his way to Santa Monica, where he opened a store in the early 1870s. It appears that Chapin probably came to Bassett for help when he found himself in trouble in Connecticut. Now, as for the choice of name, Chapin was probably an homage to Chapin's Bluff, where he was wounded during the war. Interestingly, within a few years of Chapin's arrival, both Chapin and Bassett found themselves in financial problems and filed for bankruptcy. Here you can see some articles detailing the sale of Bassett's property to cover his debts. Sadly, Bassett died in April 1881. Chapin, on the other hand, opened a store of his own in the summer of 1880 and went on to find a lot of success. The store was located at a stage stop and catered to campers in the Santa Monica Canyon. He opened a store in town and became the local Wells Fargo agent. His store also had the first telephone in the city. Chapin became one of the major retailers in Santa Monica, and his reputation grew over the years. He became the city's first treasurer when the city incorporated in 1886 and was an important booster for the city. He continued his work in politics and was appointed as a delegate to the Republican Convention in 1888. After a few years, Colonel Chapin was joined by his wife and daughter, who arrived in California in 1878 and changed their names from Packer to Chapin. As a young adult, their daughter Mary worked at her father's store as a bookkeeper. He became such an influential figure that he was often called upon to give his opinion in matters that affected the city. In December 1890, the Los Angeles Evening Express made the following statement: "The character and business capacity of Colonel Chapin is such that after a long mercantile career in Santa Monica, he has built up an immense trade and stands preeminently among her successful merchants." At the same time, the Los Angeles Times announced that his wife's business filed a petition of insolvency and was in debt over $27,000. And she listed her husband as a creditor, owing him nearly $7,000. To give you an idea of the trouble she was in 1890, $27,000 would be like $750,000 today, something like that. Given Colonel Chapin's past business failures, it does make me wonder if he put the business in his wife's name to avoid the scandal of another bankruptcy, especially since he was such a prominent figure in the city. Of course, it's impossible to know that for sure. Despite the family's financial trouble, Colonel Chapin opened another store in Santa Monica Canyon in January 1891, just 2 weeks after the news of his wife's debts were made known. Within a few months of the new store opening, Colonel Chapin fell ill. He and his wife visited Arrowhead Hot Springs in May 1891 in the hope that he would recover. And when they returned home at the end of the month, his health continued to decline. He died on July 7th, 1891. His death was announced in the Los Angeles Herald newspaper that day. And the article stated, "I am pained to be compelled to chronicle the death of Colonel E.K. Chapin, who died this morning at 5 o'clock. He had been confined to his residence for some time with a complication of troubles, which culminated in paralysis. Colonel Chapin was born in Volunteertown, Connecticut, and was in his 52nd year at his demise. He served in the late rebellion on the Union side, having enlisted in the 21st Connecticut Infantry as lieutenant. After an honorable service of 3 years, he came back as captain of a company which had participated in many engagements. He came to Santa Monica in its infancy and has lived here ever since, where his sterling manhood and thorough good nature made him the friend of everyone." He was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in Santa Monica, and he was remembered as one of the most sincere friends, a progressive citizen, one whose sympathy and aid was never asked in vain, a noble husband, father, and friend. Here you can see a picture of his infant daughter. She is the only non-military person identified in the album, but her name was a huge help in tracking the family in the post-war period. The Chapin family did remain in Santa Monica. His granddaughter, Mary Jameson, went on to marry Charles M. Brown Jr. of Redlands in 1924. Charles M. Brown Jr. was the son of Redlands pioneer of the same name, who was very prominent in state and even national politics. So C.M. Brown Sr. was the founder of the Gold Banner Association, which was the city's largest citrus marketing company at the time. Colonel Chapin's Civil War diary, military documents, and photographs were donated to Connecticut State Library in 1918, but are not available digitally. And you may be wondering how we were able to connect Perry Packer to Colonel Chapin. Well, that came when his great-granddaughter, who is also named Mary, she's the fourth Mary in a row, donated his family album to the Lincoln Shrine a few years ago. It really is a wonderful treasure and that we've been able to learn a lot from. And with that, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us this week.